Many are feared lost after a river cruise capsizes in China.
过往的团是大批公安、武警、甚至部门前在上海市闸北区政府广场前聚集了
Transport Ministry has launched a top-level emergency response and formed a lead group. He has asked rescuers to never give up hope to find more survivors.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're looking at this week. The disaster on the Yangtze River and what the coverage reveals about Beijing and how it sees the news media. In Nigeria, 4 journalists, all working on different stories, attacked in 1 week. The Anchorman, credible news source or relic from another age, and bought and paid for.
Good evening, Trinidad and Tobago.
It turns out that airtime in Trinidad is for sale. In times of crisis, the job of any government is to get help to those in need. On the communications side, those governments also want to get ahead of the story, have it told their way to limit the political damage. We've been watching such a story unfold in central China, where a cruise ship called the Eastern Star capsized in the Yangtze River, killing a reported 431 people. Shortly after the news broke, journalists got their orders from Beijing, telling them not to travel to the scene, to rely instead on official press releases and state-run news platforms for information. And the result was evident in the coverage. News outlet after news outlet publishing the same photos, painting the same picture, sticking to the same script, reporting the story Beijing's way. China is a little more than 2 years now into the leadership of Xi Jinping. As the General Secretary of the Communist Party, he has centralized institutional power, and his approach to the news media is consistent with that. However, controlling information in the digital age, with news consumers growing ever more discerning, is far from easy, even in China. Our starting point this week is the Yangtze River.
Relief workers say it's a race against time.
Disasters and the coverage of them often follow a pattern. First come the details.
A major tsunami has struck northeastern Japan.
Then the numbers,
1,400,
which inevitably grow with each successive report.
Now over 7,200.
Eventually, the rescue effort is examined.
The communication is crippled.
The shortcomings of the authorities, if there are any, revealed.
That aid is not being delivered fairly.
That's not what happened in China. Within 12 hours of the boat sinking, Beijing laid down the rules. No province, prefecture, or city will send reporters to the scene. Those who have arrived shall be called back immediately. All media should run Xinhua stories and use CCTV footage, meaning there were just 2 approved news sources, both of them state-owned.
So after the Eastern Star sank, Chinese propaganda ministers, or as they're now known to these days, publicity officials, referred most journalists to report back copy from Xinhua or CCTV. And this is primarily due to, as they purport, to reduce potential for speculation and rumors, and which on the face of it obviously sounds like something that just for the social good, you're preventing misinformation from being spread. But obviously that has the counter possibility of controlling more information more closely.
After the media directive came out from Chinese central government, there were a series of identical front pages across a number of Chinese newspapers. These had the same photograph, the same headline, hundreds feared dead, and very terse reporting, very little in the way of questions, and a very strong play given to the notion that there had been a prompt and effective response.
It's not only a strategy, it's a tradition. It's a long tradition since Communist Party came into power. They try to control media in this way. Instead, old media is acting as a mouthpiece of the party. They want to show the good side, positive side of the event. It's a long tradition of the propaganda.
It's been that way for decades. There have been periods of relative journalistic openness. In 2008, when Beijing hosted the Olympics, restrictions on the global news media were loosened slightly, although controls on domestic journalism were intensified. Still, after the Sichuan earthquake that same year, the Chinese media were notably critical of the official response. By 2011, when 2 high-speed trains collided in Wenzhou, media directives were being issued from the capital, a reassertion of Beijing's right to control the story, even in the digital age when information is harder than ever to keep contained.
we go back to the 2008 Sichuan earthquake, to the 2011 Wenzhou train crash. As for what lessons they might have learned from those two incidents with regards to the current sinking of the Eastern Star, I think they've recognized the fact that 2011 was a case where they weren't in control of the message on social media. And so in this current case, I feel like there's been a much more proactive stance to trying to shut down information.
The monopoly that the Chinese state once had over information is really lost in this respect. There's very widespread reporting, and the online sphere has really diversified that and changed that even more. So people really are sharing news in a way that they couldn't previously. Journalists are able to get leads in a way they couldn't previously. So in this context, it's actually very difficult to control the narrative. And I think for a lot of media consumers, they see through this quite quickly, and also very quickly get access to the other stories and the other conversations that are going on.
In addition to Beijing's efforts to control coverage of the Eastern Star, one of its papers, the state-owned Global Times, published an editorial saying the international media brought a biased approach to the story. The paper accused the foreign press of, quote, consuming the pain of the victims, of being eager to show the scars of Chinese society.
The editorial is trying to say most of the coverage of the tragedy from overseas media outlets are focused on the protest of the relatives of the victims.
We're not being allowed to film what is a peaceful protest of relatives,
instead of the rescuing work, and that is in sharp contrast with the work done by the local media. And here most of us are actually focusing, paying our attention on the rescuing work and different options of how to lift the ship and everything in that aspect.
So the Global Times article calling out Western journalists was obviously propaganda, but at least in the eyes of Chinese citizens, you have many people wondering why Western journalists only cover the worst stories in China. Incidents like the SARS outbreak, or the Wenzhou train crash, or the stampeding, the death of people in Shanghai in the New Year's celebration in 2014. Western journalists, at least in the eyes of Chinese people, aren't really covering the many positive aspects of development in China, and they only focus on these negative tragedies.
China has a pattern of occasionally opening itself up to ideas that come from the outside world, before then turning back inwards. The media version of that goes back to 2008 and the Beijing Games, when the country revealed slightly more of itself to the global media, until the Olympic flame went out and all those reporters went home. And since Xi Jinping took control of the Communist Party in 2013, he has centralized power and rolled back the clock on journalism and freedom of expression.
I think it's clearly, based on the past 2 years, he's not been the reformer that people had thought he had been. He's tightened control over not just internet media, but traditional media. And whether or not this is merely a temporary effort to consolidate powers, or whether this is a permanent effort by him to prevent the sort of past spreading of free media that led to the downfall of, say, the USSR, is to be seen. But clearly, based on the trajectory of the past 2 years, things are much more difficult now for journalists and media in China.
The media and our society is more controlled than before. And the political atmosphere not as open as before, particularly the internet, for social media. Think about now we have more than 30 years opening and reform policy, but only one field was not open, that is media. Probably media is the last shield to keep the legitimacy of the Communist Party's power.
On the download this week, our viewers on the coverage of the news coming out of China.
Disaster reporting always works like this in China. Something bad happens, the top leaders are very concerned, and the soldiers during the rescue fight are very brave. Although journalists cannot report it on it freely, many of them are on social media, so they can probably reveal some of the unreported side of the story.
News media and journalists enjoy more autonomy in reporting on natural disasters such as earthquake and landslides than reporting on man-made disasters such as train crash and ship sinking. So the government issued a kind of propaganda order asking news media in China to follow the stories produced by the Xinhua News Agency and the CCTV. It is easier to control 2 media outlets than to control more than thousands of medias in China.
Other media stories on our radar this week. The Supreme Court in Saudi Arabia has chosen not to spare a blogger for insulting Islam and the country. Raif Badawi ran a website called the Saudi Liberal Network. On it, he ridiculed some of the country's cultural restrictions, including the prohibition against Valentine's Day. He was sentenced last year to 10 years in jail, a fine of $266,000, as well as 1,000 lashes to be administered, quote, very harshly in public. He appealed, but the Supreme Court has upheld that decision. Back in January, an online video emerged showing Badawi getting his first 50 lashes in a public square. Subsequent lashings have been postponed on medical grounds. Philip Luther, Amnesty International's Middle East director, said that blogging is not a crime and Raif Badawi is being punished merely for daring to exercise his right to freedom of expression. Badawi's lawyer, Walid Abu al-Khair, was also sentenced to 15 years in prison for insulting the judiciary, inciting public opinion, and undermining the government and its officials. At least 4 journalists have come under attack in Nigeria, and it all happened the same week that the country's new president was being urged to protect the news media there, to allow reporters to work freely without fear of compromise. On May 29th, Joseph Heer, a reporter for the Daily Trust newspaper, was reportedly beaten into unconsciousness at a state inauguration event in Nasarawa. Heer says that supporters of the local governor were not happy with his reporting. A few days later, Kamaruddin Ogundele was beaten in the southwestern state of Ekiti. His reporting for a paper called Punch apparently upset a political faction there. And 2 more journalists, Victor Akinku Oleye of the Hope newspaper and Mohammed Atakafin Dangi, who's with the state-owned Radio Nigeria, say that they were attacked and beaten by police that same week. The New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists has said that Nigeria's new president, Muhammadu Buhari, should send a clear message that violence against journalists will not be tolerated. The gloves have come off, but the mittens are on in Trinidad over the ongoing FIFA corruption scandal. Jack Warner, a former FIFA official for Trinidad, is among those indicted on charges of corruption and money laundering. On June 3rd, he responded by paying for airtime on a Trinidadian television channel to answer some of the charges and to threaten to bring down others. The video was entitled "The Gloves Are Off." Paying broadcasters for airtime is common in Trinidad. So this past week, John Oliver, a British comic with a show on HBO in the US, did the same and addressed the people of Trinidad and Mr. Warner specifically.
And since his preferred mode of communication is evidently purchased time on Trinidad's TV6, I have bought this time in the hope that he is watching.
Oliver called the segment "The Mittens of Disapproval Are On," and he called on Warner to keep his promise and release everything in order to clean up FIFA and world football.
Why the hell not? It's not like you're not already potentially in a lot of trouble. Seriously, I've been looking through the indictment and good luck with that.
No word on how much the airtime cost Oliver and HBO, or whether Mr. Warner was among those watching.
Thank you for your time, Trinidad. I now return you to Mike and Molly.
There are whispers coming out of New York that NBC anchorman Brian Williams will not be returning to the anchor chair. It looks like Williams will permanently lose his $10 million a year job. He's currently suspended over some self-aggrandizing war stories he's told over the years, apparently to pad his journalistic resume, his qualifications for the job. The Williams story is big news in the U.S., where evening news anchors are institutions. Broadcasters still invest heavily in their anchor talent. The importance placed upon the role comes down to ratings, the number of viewers that a trusted and telegenic anchor can attract. Anchors, for that reason, have withstood countless changes in the news ecosystem all around them. But are news anchors worthy of the trust that viewers place in them, worthy of the big money that broadcasters pay them? And given the lack of gender or ethnic diversity in the chair, do anchors really reflect the audiences they serve? The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now on the talking heads who continue to rule the American airwaves, the Anchorman.
This is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
They are an American institution.
Good evening.
a succession of newsmen.
Good afternoon once again, everyone.
Who at the same time every night
I'm Peter Jennings in New York.
could be relied on to tell you the news.
As I prepared for this last broadcast as moderator...
But it is worth remembering the point that former CBS weekend anchor Bob Schieffer made while signing off Face the Nation for the last time, the show that he hosted for 24 years.
The news is not about the newscaster, it's about the people who make it.
People in America, especially at 8 o'clock in the evening while they're having their dinners with their family, they have this third guest that you go to for information, news. You trust him to deliver to you what is important.
The notion that to be a good anchor you just need to have a good haircut and a pleasing voice is true to some extent, but I think it really stops being true when you get to breaking news coverage.
Information is pouring into our newsroom.
That's where these people really demonstrate their skills. There are very few people who can sit there in front of audiences that large and explain fairly well events that are taking shape at that moment.
It's that ability that gets certain journalists into the anchor chair and the big money that comes with it. Scott Pelley of CBS reportedly earns $5 million a year. Brian Williams of NBC was on $10 million a year, but more on him later. And David Muir's salary at ABC is unknown, but his predecessor, Diane Sawyer, earned a reported $20 million a year. How much money anchors are paid is down to ratings, the number of viewers they attract. If the ratings are good, the anchor gets the credit. If they plummet, the anchor takes the fall. So while revenues slide and budgets shrink, the salaries of top news anchors keep going up, while those actually doing the reporting in the field are either laid off or paid a fraction of what the anchors earn.
The personality-driven newscast speaks to, I think, some of the inherent conflicts of interest within the news system itself. That is not judged on its journalism, it's judged on whether the ratings are being achieved, which ultimately puts unbelievable amount of importance on the anchor person.
If you think that the pinnacle of journalism is reporting, well, anchors do less of it than a lot of people. If you think the pinnacle of reporting is explaining, well, in the three traditional network newscasts, they only last a half hour. There's not a lot of room for explaining. There are a lot of journalists today, and many of them online actually, who explain stories, who give analysis of stories, who help me understand stories a lot better than whoever happens to be holding the anchor chair on a major network.
Breaking news and a story that many people...
The term anchorman may have been coined in the US, but the position and the influence that comes with it are global. In Israel, Chaim Yavin spent so long in the chair that he earned the nickname Mr. Television. Enrico Mentana has not only been the news anchor on the three main Italian broadcasters, but simultaneously served as the editor-in-chief of those channels as well. And in China, Bai Yang-song has been the mainstay of CCTV for over 2 decades, where his show pulls in hundreds of millions of viewers. A news anchor's authority traditionally comes from years spent reporting in the field, earning their stripes in dangerous places, which is why if they lack that experience, TV bosses have been known to parachute their anchors into hotspots to try and cement their credibility, or as one exec put it, manufacture authority. But as NBC in the US learned in the case of Brian Williams, that strategy can go wrong. You can manufacture controversy.
2 of our 4 helicopters were hit by ground fire, including the one I was in.
No kidding.
Williams was sent to Iraq in 2003 and returned with a story that turned out, as the years passed by, to be less and less accurate.
On the ground, we learned the Chinook ahead of us was almost blown out of the sky.
It transpired that Williams was traveling in a helicopter about an hour behind the one that was hit. But that's not how he used to recall the incident on air.
When the helicopter we were traveling in was forced down after being hit by an RPG.
It wasn't until he told the story again earlier this year that he got called out by some of the soldiers involved as a liar.
I made a mistake in recalling the events of 12 years ago. I want to apologize.
Williams belongs to a growing number of news anchors who get their fair share of airtime away from the newsroom, who use their celebrity to try and reach a wider audience.
Americans are the most entertained and least informed. So cable news, instead of catering more news, they went to the formula of infotainment. So the anchor changed. It became a guy that is a celebrity, that is charismatic. So they're catering to an audience that doesn't want only news, but will want also entertainment.
Brian Williams was probably the best known and the best liked precisely because he made an effort to kind of establish an image for himself outside of the news studio. And in so doing, he would appear on late night comedy shows and cavort with Jimmy Fallon.
Give it up for Brian Williams!
But in the end, these were the kinds of appearances that derailed him.
Suddenly goes dark.
NBC suspended Brian Williams, and his future remains in doubt. He was replaced by Lester Holt, the first African American to be the sole anchor of the evening news on a major US network. Holt competes for viewers in the marquee 6:30 p.m. news slot with ABC's David Muir and CBS's Scott Pelley. In 24-hour cable news, the 8 p.m. slot is the prestige job, and those anchors, Bill O'Reilly on Fox, Anderson Cooper on CNN, and Chris Hayes on MSNBC, are not exactly the most diverse group.
Our media system has been segregated for a long time. It wasn't until the 1960s that the first wave of journalists of color started entering the newsroom, but white males controlled the industry. You know, white males were the first broadcast owners, the first TV station owners. They run these companies that became networks. Very few people of color actually, to this day, own any radio TV stations. So the world is seen through a white male perspective.
While the anchormen of the network newscasts at the moment are, white and male, anyone who watches these newscasts knows that the correspondents who report to them are a diverse group. And indeed, so are the producers and other people who support them behind the scenes. And undoubtedly, the anchormen and anchorwomen of the future will be drawn from this diverse group.
But I want to see that diversity actually means something. I want that anchor chair to be beyond just a figurehead. So for me, while I want Latinos and African Americans and Asian Americans and all people of color to have a shot because they're journalists, it has to be that anchor person who has the ability to shape the news and shape the perspective that news is being told from.
Today's news anchors are the products of 60 years of broadcast history. But what kind of future awaits the position? In the age of 24-hour news, 30-minute broadcasts are becoming anachronisms. News outlets have a decision to make, whether to spend their money on the faces of their channels or on their journalism.
More voices on the download now. Our viewers on that broadcasting institution, the Anchorman.
Where the problems happened is when the anchor started to overshadow everything else in terms of power. The anchor may be the face, but there are still people above making decisions. So I think where kind of the disconnect happens is when one person becomes more powerful than the rest of the news organization, and there isn't this checks and balances on how that person makes decisions and whether or not it's in the best interest of the entire news organization.
With the emergence of technology, people are able to pick and choose where they get their information and where they get their news from. So I don't think that the old archetype is ever going to go away. But like a lot of things in our culture, technology is forcing journalism to change.
So it's clear that network news bosses have got a lot to consider when deciding who to put in that all-important anchor chair. But when you break down the formula, is it really that complex? Usually they decide on a man, and as long as he looks good in his suit, heroic in a flak jacket, and concerned at the scene of a disaster, that's pretty much the job description right there. We'll leave you with this quick and handy guide produced for us by animator Beini Huang, who's based in New York City, on how to create America's next top news anchor. And we'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
Sure.